Hey, I'm Scotty McDonald, and thank you so much for downloading episode 2 of Brisbane is Weird. Before we get into the episode, 2 quick things for you. Firstly, at the end of this episode, I've got a really quick preview of the next episode of Brisbane is Weird. It's a really bizarre thing that's going on in certain parts of Brisbane that I reckon a lot of people have experienced, so I'm quite excited to share it with you. Secondly, some of the stuff that I discovered while researching for this podcast doesn't kind of really add to the story, so I kept it out. But I want to share it with you anyway. So you'll find a special post on facebook.com/BrisbaneIsWeird with some of the random stuff I learnt while making this episode. So here it is, episode 2, The Murder That Built Brisbane. Let me take you back to start off 1848. But I promise we will finish in 2017. It's a Saturday morning when a local Brisbane family are out cruising on their boat down the Brisbane River and they notice the lower abdomen and legs of a human. Robert Cox is who they belong to, and his body is found in long grass further up from the river. His head found by a dog in a building site around the corner. To make it even more creepy, the head's propped up in a way to make whoever found it feel like it was staring at them. He'd just come into Brisbane after making a stack of cash selling wood just south of the Gold Coast in the Tweed area. He was visiting his mate Andrew Fife, who is the cook at the local hotel, the Bush Inn. Fife would ultimately be tried, convicted, and then hanged for the murder of his friend Robert Cox. 17 years later, a man by the name of Patrick Mayne, who was on Brisbane's first ever council, whose money is the reason that UQ has their beautiful campus at St Lucia, and who, in my opinion, is the reason that the Queen Street Mall is like the central shopping district of Brisbane. He lies on his deathbed and confesses to the murder and robbery of Robert Cox. I'm Scotty McDonald, and this is Brisbane is Weird, a podcast uncovering the weird stories that make up this amazing Australian city. Some from the past and some still happening today. If you have a weird story of something you've seen in Brisbane, or you just want to solve a Brisbane urban legend, then message us on the website at brisbaneisweird.com. You can also find previous episodes there and on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever it is you use to tune in. So I'm pretty much standing exactly where the murder would have taken place. Where the Bush Inn was is now a 5-storey apartment block right next to the Story Bridge at Kangaroo Point. There's a really nice park here now as well. If Patrick committed the murder, he would have had no idea of the impact that it had on building this city. In fact, really eerily, you can actually see quite clearly All Hallows from where the murder was committed. It's a school, and while it wouldn't have been there when the murder was committed, Patrick's eldest daughter not only went to school there, studied to be a nun there, but ended up in the later parts of her life being locked in a room in a straitjacket there, presumably, at least potentially, because of the same gene of madness that could have led her dad to commit this murder, potentially another murder. The thing is, though, and the reason why I'm so captivated by this story, so excited by this story from when I read it in the book The Main Inheritance over 10 years ago, which, by the way, if you do want to study this more, there is a link to this book in the show notes at brisbaneisweird.com/2, is because there's another injustice that came as a result of this murder. And if Patrick did commit the murder, which, to be honest, I believe he did, it's really sad, this injustice. If he didn't commit the murder, then it's heartbreaking, and it's to do with his youngest son, James. More on James, and how if you've ever lived in Brisbane, he's definitely impacted your life in some way, soon. So how does the wrong man get hanged for this crime? Well, from what we can tell, the trial was a bit of a sham. Not long after the body was found, Andrew Fife's room gets searched because this rumour had gone around that Robert Cox had been sleeping in his room, but it's pretty well established that was probably untrue. In his room, they do find a bloody rag, but it's also noted that he has really badly chapped lips, and chances are it was from him wiping the blood off his lips. 2 days later, his room gets searched again, Except this time, they find blood all over the floor that somehow they didn't see the first time and they believed must have been there from the murder, even though they didn't see it the first time. It combined with the fact that Cox's clothes are found in the back of the oven at the Bush Inn, it kind of becomes like the nail in the coffin for him. So if Fife didn't do it, why do we suddenly jump on Patrick Mayne as guilty? So there is some talk of a deathbed confession, but there's no full-on proof of this. There are a few sus things going on, though. Patrick and his work friends, they all work together at the Boiling Down Works, kind of like an abattoir where they cut up and prepare meat. They're all more or less butchers. They come and go from the Bush Inn so many times that night. And there is some speculation that they had all decided to rob Robert Cox, because everyone knew he was rich. His friends report that they came back to the Bush Inn later that night, found Patrick Mayne there, and Patrick reported that Robert was gone and couldn't find him. Surely they were sus that Patrick had gone ahead and done the robbery himself, but they're not going to come out and say that because that indicts them in the whole thing. As well as that, I did mention that Patrick was a butcher, and at the start, I kind of talked about how well cut up the body was. We're talking really well cut up, like everything was cut open in the right place, intestines were ripped out and found in the bottom of the well, cartilage was separated from his ribs, his spine was cut in half, like, you know, really gross stuff that only a butcher would know how to do. And of course, the blood found in Andrew Fife's room. If you're a butcher, you've got ample access to blood, right? None of this, though, is a smoking gun. So I want to tell you about the 17 years that take place between Robert Cox dying and Patrick Mayne dying. This is 17 years of some of the most important development in Brisbane. And I think it's 17 years that prove one of the people that built Brisbane off money that he stole from a man he murdered. Not long after Robert Cox is murdered, Patrick's employer, the Kangaroo Point Boiling Down Works, move out to Moggill, which is like on the border of Brisbane and Ipswich. And he spends a year working out there where they look after him pretty well. He ends up marrying his wife, Mary, in that year. And then they buy property on Queen Street where they build a butcher's shop and their house and they move back to Brisbane. There's a few interesting things going on here. First of all, Patrick was poor. He grew up in Ireland, like dirt poor, to the point where he had to drop out of school to feed himself, not to feed his family, but to feed himself. He gets an opportunity to move to Australia where he's going to make his fortune, ends up in Brisbane working as a butcher, and really is just not making that much cash. Where he gets together the £240 to build this shop, no one really has any answer to that. It would be fair to say, but there's no proof of it, that Robert Cox probably had that kind of cash on him when he was robbed that was never recovered. Secondly, disappearing for a year after a major event is a really good way to kind of clear the air so people aren't asking questions. And this is at a time around 1849, 1850, where Brisbane is growing that quickly. Like, in the space of a decade, it goes from 1,200 people to 30,000 people. So the population's moving that fast, things are changing that quickly, it's moving from like a small colony into like a town, that people have kind of forgotten what happened at Kangaroo Point and questioning if Mayne was involved. Thirdly, in his first year living on Queen Street in Brisbane town, Patrick Mayne ends up in court so many times for stuff like having random outbursts and beating people up, including police officers who are just doing their job, through to underpaying staff, stealing people's livestock. There's also this really weird story directly across the road from where Patrick's house and shop was, which, by the way, is where the Regent Theatre is on Queen Street Mall now. His mate owned a hotel, like a bar. One night, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and his mate's awoken to someone trying to steal his money, and he like lets out a cry and, you know, goes after this guy. And as he gets up to go after him, Patrick Mayne just appears from around the corner and it's like, bro, what's going on? Can I help you? It's 2 o'clock in the morning in like 1850. People look at me weird when I go out at 2 o'clock in the morning in 2017, and there's places to go now. It just feels a little bit sus. Despite all of this, despite his upbringing, Patrick's actually a brilliant businessman though. he manages to buy up a lot of property. In fact, the Brisbane property records during the 1850s really clearly show his name a lot. He owns stuff out at Moggill, he owns Milton, Paddington, Albion, like all over the city he's got these grazing fields. And he also owns quite a few properties and builds shops on them in that Queen Street district. And they're really well architecturally designed shops. They've got some of the first lighting installs in Brisbane. Like, he's doing really well for himself and making quite a lot of money. There's also another story I want to tell. You can take from it what you want. Where Suncorp Stadium now stands in Milton, in Brisbane, it used to be a series of like water holes that kind of made up a creek. And the Mains owned that bit of property. Actually, jump on Google Maps right now. If you search Mainview Street in Milton, it's just next to Suncorp Stadium, named after that family. He had a guy by the name of Jacob working on that property. Jacob, by the looks of things, was probably suffering from a mental illness, probably depression. And it means that he's quite an ineffective worker. He has a lot of days off, has a lot of days just doing a really crap standard of work. On top of that, Patrick can't fire him because of kind of the system he's been employed under. If Patrick fires him, he can get sued for like 2 years. Like he's a pain in the butt of an employee in Patrick's kind of non-compassionate eyes. One day, Jacob goes missing. He gets found drowned at the bottom of one of these watering holes, a 6-foot watering hole, and he's got his trousers in his hand. At his death inquest, Patrick suggests that he was kind of washing his clothes when he fell in. He also mentions at this death inquest that Jacob was terrified of him. You make up your own mind what actually happened to Jacob. A year later, Patrick gets elected to the first Brisbane Council. Brisbane is finally kind of developing into the city that it is now. And it's got its own host of problems. For example, Queen Street is really just a boggy marsh, but it's the centre of town. There's a lot of fires going on, which are like knocking out half the buildings in the city. There's natural disasters, floods, all kinds of stuff going on. And so they finally build this council that can start making decisions for the city. Patrick does some great work on it, and he's noted as being very passionate. School kids, for example, can use the ferries for free to get to school. As his terms in council go on more and more, though, his passion turns to being argumentative. He carries with him a monocle, and he wears it and mocks people who are arguing for things that he disagrees with. In fact, it's noted that some of the meetings actually stop down quite often because people are distracted by this whole monocle situation. And in his final year on council, his absence is noted a lot, and him showing up confused about things also gets noted a lot. By August of 1865, he's full-time bedridden with a nurse living with him. And it's the same month that he dies, and apparently confesses to the murder of Robert Cox. To fuel this idea that he did make a deathbed confession, Patrick's wife Mary and his kids agree that there's a line of madness in the family and they're never to have kids. In fact, never to get married. By the time 1940 comes, his final child has died, and that's it. The main family is done. Turns out they weren't entirely wrong. Rosanna, his oldest daughter, goes on to become a nun at All Hallows, and as her life goes on, she has such strong fits of madness that she's recorded to spend more and more time being held back in a straitjacket. There's also his son Isaac. Not long after Patrick dies, the family moves out to a home they build in Toowong called Morelands. It actually still exists on the property of the Wesley Hospital. Isaac gets locked permanently in his room after a man is found murdered on the train tracks just behind their home at Moreland, which, by the way, still run through Auchenflower at that location. It's kind of eerie now that you know that next time you're there. Sorry. Then, not long after this, they ship Isaac to Sydney to a mental hospital where sadly he takes his own life. So did Patrick do it? Were his fits of rage actually indicative of the fact that he was a murderer? And therefore, were his kids' madness also a gene that was running rogue in him? According to Brisbane Town, yeah. And the family's name became mud that would never be washed off. And this is the part of the story I actually wanted to get to. Because the person it affected the most was James Main, Patrick's youngest son. And the injustice it caused him is absolute crap, because what that guy did for this city is amazing. James studied at the University of Sydney to become a doctor. A good doctor at that. I mean, the fact that he never was going to have kids or get married kind of meant his dedication to his job was through the roof. His family's wealth meant that he actually never took a paycheck from the General Brisbane Hospital, which is now the Royal Brisbane Hospital at Hurston. He just kept investing that money they were meant to pay him back into the hospital. And he grew up the ranks really quickly to the point that he ends up as the director of this hospital. Donates the first X-ray plant, X-ray machine in Queensland. When Isaac's starting to show these signs of murderous rage, they even allow him to take massive amounts of time off to deal with it. He tries to resign and they won't let him. Around this same time, Queensland's looking to build a flagship university right here in Brisbane. They want it to specialise in medicine, to train the future doctors of Australia right here in Brisbane. And as such, they want it next to the Brisbane General Hospital. The land that they're looking at is where the Victoria Park Golf Course is now, sort of opposite the Royal Brisbane Hospital out at Hurston. James thinks that sucks. He thinks it needs to be on a riverside location where students can meander in deep thoughts walking along the river and have really important debates and arguments in land that's fitting of the prestige of what they're doing. Exactly what the University of Queensland St Lucia campus is like now. So he basically forces their hand by buying this land at St Lucia. And they try and reject it. They say that students are going to get sick because of the river mist, that it's too far out of the city, and there's a subtle undertone of, your family has a bad name, so we don't want to take your land and forever mar this university. Eventually, like over a decade later, they build the university there. They get a portrait commissioned of James Mayne that's going to hang in the main administration hall. But then it gets hidden in storage. The university seems so ashamed to be connected with this family's name and the idea that a murder was committed to fund what they're doing. When James and his younger sister die in 1940, they give almost their entire wealth to the University of Queensland. We're talking over £300,000 in 1940, a lot of money. But on top of that, decades before he died, James had the family home on Queen Street knocked down, and he built a multi-level shopping arcade there. It's actually still standing, the Brisbane Arcade, and it's actually still part of the main estate. And it actually funds millions of dollars every year to the medical school of UQ. It goes into a scholarship program. It wasn't until 1972 that the University of Queensland named Mayne Hall in honour of the family, and most people think it's Mayne Hall as in M-A-I-N. The actual tribute to James Mayne is kind of hidden in a back corner of the hall. In 1995, the Mayne Medical School was named. Since then, a number of things have been named at UQ that point back to the Mayne family. Around Brisbane, Mayne Road, M-A-Y-N-E, Mayne Junction, which is out near Albion, Mainview Street that I mentioned in Milton, as well as Patrick and Isaac Street in Milton, 3 stained glass windows in St Stephen's Cathedral in Brisbane, and that's really the entire memory that we have of this family. Archbishop Jewig, who was the Catholic Archbishop at the time of James Mayne's death, spoke of him as being noble and unselfish. William Jolly and John Chandler, they're both ex-Brisbane mayors, and they demanded that UQ acknowledge James's contribution. There's a quote from someone very senior at UQ who said it's time that their name was removed from the mire and given the place of honour that they deserve. The Royal Brisbane Hospital at Hurston, its foundation years were funded by James Mayne. The Queen Street Mall's development was really pushed forward by Patrick and James Mayne. And the University of Queensland owes so much, right down to the very land they sit on and show pride in to this very day. And yet, this story sits in darkened history books. And it sucks. Because James Mayne seems like one of the most amazing noble figures that we have to look up to in this city. If you want to know more about this story, you can grab hold of the book The Mayne Inheritance from the show notes at brisbaneisweird.com/2. I'm Scotty McDonald, and if you have any stories of Brisbane being weird, hit us up at brisbaneisweird.com. Okay, I did promise at the start that I did have a preview of the next episode for you. Before I get to it, don't forget, we learnt so much putting together that podcast that we couldn't include it all. I want to share some of it with you. You can find a link to it on the Facebook page, facebook.com/BrisbaneIsWeird. Here is a quick preview of episode 3. In 2012, me and my mate Christian stumbled across something really weird in the small western suburb of Jamboree Heights.
Hunting is quite an aggressive word, but we went looking for them.
But there were people commenting saying, I've been trying to prove this for ages and no one believes me that they're around here.
Yeah, they definitely were around there that night.
Well, we saw like 3 on the side of the road.
It was so strange.
But I don't even think... There's not many in Australia, at least not many in Brisbane.
Yeah.
There couldn't be.
Seriously, it was the first time I saw them, like, where we found them.
Yeah, they're pretty scary.
That's next time on Brisbane is Weird.